Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, I bring you the next chapter in the story of Hùng and Hoài Ca, a quiet stretch of life, yet one filled with hope, beginning on what seemed like an ordinary morning in the familiar mountains. That morning, the air felt gentler than in the days before. The dry chill of the long night had retreated, giving way to a fragile warmth spreading through the space. A thin veil of mist still clung to the mountain slopes, casting a pale white over the treetops, but it slowly dissolved under the weak light of early dawn. As the fog faded, the familiar winding paths emerged, leading deep into the old forest, a place Hoài Ca had walked countless times. She stood still for a moment at the forest's edge, breathing in the scent of earth and leaves still damp with dew. Slung over her shoulder was an old basket that had accompanied her for many years, its straps worn by time. To Hoài Ca, it was more than a tool, it was a silent companion on journeys like this. She adjusted the strap, fixed her gaze on the depths of the forest, then stepped forward slowly yet decisively. In her heart, she carried a very small hope, to find a few medicinal herbs, just enough to help someone in need endure a few more difficult days. The morning forest was unusually quiet. The calls of birds were sparse, mingling with the sound of dry leaves crumbling beneath her feet. Hoài Ca moved carefully, her eyes scanning every tree trunk and clump of grass along the path. She knew this forest well, knew how harshly it changed with each season. And she also knew that this was the most difficult time of year to find medicine. As expected, after walking a while, she found tangled vines intertwined with one another lush on the surface, yet when examined closely, their roots beneath were nearly depleted. Some plants looked healthy at first glance, their leaves still green and stems still tall, but once dug up, the roots had long since rotted, no longer suitable for medicine. Hoài Ca let out a soft sigh. Each time this happened, a sense of regret rose within her, but she did not allow herself to give up. She understood that the mountains could be unforgiving and did not always offer what people hoped for. She continued from one tree to the next, searching and observing carefully. There were herbs she recognized, but could not harvest at this time. If taken too early, not only would their medicinal value be insufficient, but the plant itself could be damaged, leaving nothing for future seasons. For such plants, Hoài Ca simply marked the spot, a dry twig lightly tucked against the trunk, a sign known only to her. She promised herself she would return on a more suitable day, when the plant was ready to be used effectively. Time passed slowly. Sunlight began to pierce through the dense canopy, casting long streaks of light across the forest floor. Beads of sweat appeared on Hoài Ca's forehead, soaking into her neatly tied hair. Her hands were smeared with soil and sticky with sap, yet her movements remained steady and practiced. Every step, every careful inspection revealed a patience and meticulousness honed over many years. Finally, after a long stretch of walking, Hoài Ca found what she was looking for. It was not much, but it was precious under the current circumstances. Some herbs were reduced to just a few small roots hidden deep in the damp earth. Others were rare young leaves that still retained their medicinal properties. She harvested them carefully, selecting only what was needed, then placed them neatly into the basket on her shoulder. Each time another herb went in, a faint look of relief flickered in her eyes, as though a portion of the burden in her heart had been eased. When the basket reached a modest weight, Hoài Ca stopped and straightened, looking around the forest one last time. She knew these herbs would only be enough to brew medicine to sustain the patient temporarily, to help maintain life, while waiting for further chances. It was not a complete solution, but for now it was all she could do. Hoài Ca turned and left the forest, her steps slower than when she had entered, carrying both exhaustion and hope. The morning continued in its quiet calm, but within her, Every step was bound to responsibility and unspoken worry. And from these small, humble moments, the story of Hung and Hoai Ca continued to unfold, quietly yet persistently, awaiting the changes yet to come. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Hung continued his long, exhausting days searching for his mother, days that passed heavily, as if with no end in sight. Every morning when he woke up, he reminded himself to stay calm, to remain patient, yet deep inside, the emptiness and fear only grew stronger. He had traveled to nearly every place imaginable, from remote residential areas, bus stations, and small roadside markets, to isolated regions that people hesitated to visit even by name. Wherever there was a rumor, no matter how faint, Hung never ignored it. He went to the authorities, recounting the entire story, from the day his mother disappeared to the unusual signs that had appeared beforehand. Files were opened, statements carefully recorded, but as time passed, the phone calls he waited for brought nothing but prolonged silence. Each time he left the offices, Hung felt heavier, as though every step pulled him deeper into a nameless despair. He understood that in cases like this, clues could arrive very slowly or sometimes never at all. During long nights, Hung barely slept. He sat alone in his small room, yellow light casting shadows across his gaunt face. Images of his mother replayed endlessly in his mind, sometimes her familiar gentle smile, sometimes her weary figure in the days just before she vanished. He blamed himself, wondering if it was his own carelessness that had led her into such a fate. That sense of helplessness clung to him, making each passing day feel twice as heavy. Then one day, just as Hung was nearly drained of both physical and emotional strength, something unexpected happened. A stranger came to Hoai Ca's house. They had never met before. The person looked simple, spoke in a low, measured voice, yet their eyes carried hesitation, as if weighing every word before speaking. They said they had asked around and searched for quite some time to find this place, because it was connected to a woman Hung was desperately looking for. The news struck Hung like a heavy blow. When the stranger mentioned his mother's name, his heart tightened, caught between hope and fear. The person explained that while passing along a deserted road on the outskirts of town, they had discovered a woman lying motionless by the roadside, her body covered in injuries. She had been in critical condition, bruises all over her body, clear signs of having been beaten and abandoned by criminals. Had help arrived even a little later, everything might have ended very differently. That stranger, along with a few local residents, brought her to a safe place. Because resources were limited and they could not take her far right away, they used available herbal remedies to stop the bleeding, ease the pain, and keep her alive through the initial danger. The days that followed were filled with sleepless nights, taking turns caring for her, boiling medicine, applying herbal compresses, doing everything they could to help her survive. Gradually, through persistence and devotion, her health began to show signs of recovery. Hearing this, Hung was almost frozen. His ears rang, and all the sounds around him seemed to fade away. After so many days of searching and despair, after preparing himself again and again for the worst, he was now hearing that his mother was still alive. Emotions exploded inside him, relief mixed with pain, so overwhelming that he did not know how to react. Hung immediately went to meet the person who had saved his mother. He listened carefully, not missing a single detail. The stranger spoke clearly about the wounds on her body, about the pain that caused her to moan unconsciously through many nights, about moments when it seemed she might not survive. Every word cut into Hung's heart like a knife, filling him with both sorrow and fury at what his mother had endured. Although she had passed the immediate danger, the stranger made it clear that Hung's mother's health could not yet be considered stable. The prolonged injuries, both physical and psychological, would require a great deal of time to heal. She was still weak, still dependent on medicine and careful daily care. Hearing this, Hung could only lower his head, fists clenched tightly, as a powerful determination rose within him. He knew his journey was far from over, but at least, in the thick darkness that surrounded him, a faint light had finally appeared, guiding him forward once more. Hung understood one thing very clearly, no matter how painful it was for him to accept. For now, he still could not bring his mother home. Everything was far too dangerous. The debt to the loan sharks still hung overhead like an invisible noose. One small slip, and everything he had struggled to protect could collapse in an instant. If his mother appeared, if the wrong people discovered she was still alive and where she was, the danger would return, perhaps even more brutally than before. Thinking of that, Hung forced himself to swallow his own emotions. He asked the person who had saved his mother to continue hiding her whereabouts, to keep everything strictly confidential. He bowed his head deeply, his voice lowered as he made the request, as if every word carried a heavy burden of responsibility. He asked them to continue taking care of his mother for a few more days, just a little more time, so he could settle everything properly. Once those threats were dealt with, once he was certain no one could harm her anymore, he would personally come to bring her home, safely and openly. Leaving that place, Hung walked slowly. The road ahead looked the same as always, familiar, yet strangely distant, but inside him raged a storm of emotions that would not settle. He felt relieved knowing his mother was still alive, knowing that all those days of desperate searching had not been meaningless. Yet alongside that relief was a heavy ache he could not shake, the pain of a son who knew his mother was out there, but still could not be by her side, could not hold her hand, could not tell her that he had finally found her. Each of Hung's steps slowed under the weight of tangled thoughts. He told himself he had to be stronger, more patient, because a single wrong decision could make everything irreversible. He understood that protecting his mother now did not mean staying close to her, but keeping her hidden, far away from all the dangers still lurking in the shadows. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Hoài Ca continued her journey through the forest. After gathering enough medicinal herbs for the first trip, she did not stop. In her mind lingered another remedy, rarer, harder to find, but one that would greatly improve the effectiveness of the treatment if she could obtain it. Thinking of the person who needed the medicine, Hoài Ca tightened her grip on the basket strap and continued along the narrow trail leading deeper into the forest. This path was steeper than she had expected. The damp ground, soaked by days of mist and rain, made the surface slippery, with twisted roots protruding like invisible traps. Hoài Ca slowed her pace, carefully watching each step, but the forest does not always give people a second chance. In a brief moment of inattention, her foot slipped on a wet patch of earth. She lost her balance and fell hard down the slope. The sudden fall sent a sharp pain through Hoài Ca's body. A searing ache shot from her foot up to her knee, forcing her to bite her lip to keep from crying out. She tried to push herself up, breathing hard, her heart pounding with fear. When she looked around more clearly, she realized she had slid down near a rocky cave. Surrounding her were steep, gray stone walls slick with damp moss. Only a small amount of light filtered in from outside, just enough to reveal dark, uneven paths stretching ahead. Hoài Ca tried to move her leg, but the pain flared again, making her freeze. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Years of traveling through the forest had taught her that panic would only make things worse. She lifted her head and examined her surroundings, searching for a way to climb back up, but the rock faces were too high and slippery. It would not be easy to return the way she came. The silence around her was unsettling, broken only by the sound of dripping water echoing somewhere nearby, each slow drop amplifying the sense of isolation. Instinctively, Hoài Ca took out her phone. The screen lit up briefly, then delivered an unpleasant truth. No signal. Not a single bar. She stood frozen, a chill running down her spine. Deep in the forest like this, losing contact meant she would have to rely on herself. Hoài Ca put the phone away and leaned back against the rock wall, trying to steady herself. In her mind, she began to assess everything: the injury in her leg, the basket of herbs still intact, the changing light outside as time passed. She knew she could not stay here for too long. But the path ahead, shrouded in the darkness of the cave and the deep forest, seemed to open into yet another trial, silent and unpredictable, waiting for her to face it alone. Hoài Ca struggled to her feet. The pain in her leg made every step feel unbearably heavy, but she did not allow herself to sit still for too long. She carefully followed the narrow paths around the cave area, feeling her way step by step, one hand sliding along the cold, damp rock wall to keep her balance. Yet every route she tried led to another dead end, either rock walls closing in tightly or slippery slopes she could not continue climbing. The sense of being trapped gradually became clear, not through panic, but through a deep, aching fatigue spreading throughout her body. Time passed slowly. Outside, the sky began to change color. The light filtering through the cracks in the rocks was no longer bright like it had been in the morning. It grew weaker, paler. The last streaks of sunlight stretched across the damp stone floor, then slowly faded away. Hoài Ca realized night was approaching. She stopped and sat down on a flatter rock, leaning her back against the wall, breathing heavily. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself, reminding herself to stay calm and not panic. Years of traveling through the forest had taught her that in situations like this, clear-headedness was the most important thing. Hoài Ca took out her phone and looked at the dark screen with no signal. She hesitated briefly, then turned it off completely and put it back in her pocket. She decided to conserve the battery for when it might truly be needed. In her mind, she began to calculate how much light was left, how long her leg could endure the pain, and whether there were any paths she had not yet tried. Despite her exhaustion, she still held on to the hope that before darkness fully fell, she might find another way out. Elsewhere, in the familiar small house, Hùng began to feel uneasy. He called Hoài Ca again and again, the ringing tones stretching on before fading into silence. At first, he thought she might be deep in the forest with weak signal, or busy with her hands and unable to answer. But as time passed, that silence no longer felt normal. Each unanswered call added a little more weight to his chest. Tony returned from school, set his backpack down, then ran to the door and stood looking out at the familiar road. His eyes followed every passerby, hoping one of them would be his mother. But the road remained quiet. He went back inside, asked softly, then returned to the doorway again, repeating the motion like an unconscious habit. Watching his son, Hùng felt a complicated ache rise within him. He tried to remain calm, reassuring Tony that his mother would be home soon, but even he was no longer sure whether he was comforting his child or himself. Outside, the afternoon shadows stretched longer. The last light of day slowly disappeared, giving way to deepening dusk. When the first lights in the neighborhood began to flicker on, Hoài Ca still had not returned. The house grew unusually quiet. Hùng coaxed Tony to eat, all the while repeatedly glancing toward the door, his ears straining to catch even the smallest sound. Every passing motorbike, every distant footstep sparked a brief moment of hope, followed by disappointment. The worry inside Hùng grew with each passing minute. Unwelcome thoughts began to creep into his mind, no matter how hard he tried to push them away. He remembered Hoài Ca's trips into the forest, the steep paths, the dangerous depths of the woods. The silence of the phone now felt like a frightening sign. Hùng knew he could not continue waiting in helpless uncertainty. Finally, when night had fully fallen, Hùng made his decision. He hurriedly put on his jacket, told Tony to stay close, then took his son's hand and stepped outside. He did not know what he would find, nor where he should even begin, but he knew one thing for certain: he could not wait any longer. Hùng led Tony through the familiar markets and along the roads Hoài Ca often passed each day, asking everyone he met, clinging to the fragile hope that someone might have seen her before nightfall. Darkness settled in, covering everything with a heavy stillness. In Hung's heart, worry and unease blended together, urging him to move faster, to keep searching without rest. And within that darkness, Hung's search for Hoài Ca began, quiet yet filled with anxiety, like an invisible thread connecting those who were waiting for one another amid uncertainty. Meanwhile, deep in the silent forest, Hoài Ca leaned her back against the icy rock wall, her labored breathing echoing clearly in the confined space. The pain in her legs made it impossible for her to stretch them out. Every small movement sent a sharp ache shooting up her spine. Her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, where tangled paths seemed to swallow what little light remained. She knew she did not have much time left. Her phone battery was slowly draining, and once that screen went dark, she would truly be isolated in the depths of the forest. Hoài Ca gently closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe more evenly to stay calm. She reminded herself to remain alert, to think carefully, step by step. Years of living and moving through the forest had taught her many survival skills, but in this situation, injured and surrounded by unfamiliar terrain, all that experience suddenly felt fragile. Even so, she refused to give in to despair. In her mind appeared the image of the small, familiar house, where Hùng and Tony were surely waiting for her to return, just as they did every day. Thinking of that made Hoài Ca's heart tighten. She knew all too well how worried Hùng must be by now. She imagined him pacing restlessly, glancing at his phone and then toward the door, trying to hide his anxiety in front of Tony. And Tony, the boy, was surely standing at the doorway, his clear eyes fixed on the familiar road, waiting for his mother's figure to appear. That thought strengthened Hoài Ca's resolve. She could not collapse here. She had to find a way out, even if it was only the smallest path leading back home. In two different places, two worries were silently stretching the fragile thread of one family's fate. On one side was Hoài Ca, alone in the deep forest, facing the darkness, the pain, and the exhaustion slowly closing in on her with each passing minute. On the other was Hùng, a man who had already endured too many upheavals, who had tasted despair while searching for his mother, only to grasp a fragile hope when he learned she was still alive. Hùng had just found his mother after so many days lost in fear and self-reproach. He had not yet fulfilled his duty as a son, had not yet brought her home under his protection, when now the woman he loved most had fallen into danger. These two fears overlapped, leaving him no moment to breathe. Inside Hùng, that familiar sense of helplessness rose again, but this time more violently than ever. Night slowly closed in on the forest, covering everything in a thick, suffocating darkness. The trails that had been visible during the day were now nothing more than vague shadows, filled with hidden dangers. The wind whispered through the treetops, cold and haunting, as if reminding them that time was not on anyone's side. Within that space, the search continued, with no clear end in sight. Hoài Ca rested her head against the rock wall and opened her eyes to stare into the endless darkness ahead. She silently prayed that she would remain clear-headed, strong enough to find a way out before her body could no longer obey her will. With each passing minute, that hope was fragile, yet it was the only thing keeping her upright. And Hung, moving through the night with a heavy heart, was forced to protect his mother from dangers not yet gone, while also searching for his wife amid overwhelming uncertainty. The road ahead of him was not only made of dark paths, but of difficult choices waiting to be made. Will Hoài Ca find a way out before she collapses, before the darkness swallows the last fragile hope? And what dangers will Hung face as he carries, at the same time, the responsibilities of a son and a husband through a night filled with uncertainty? The answers still lie ahead. And their fate, in this moment, remains suspended, caught between darkness and a fragile hope that has not yet gone out.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình nhé. Mình đang bây giờ mới đang làm video thì chắc sáng mai mình mới lên video. Tạm biệt mọi người, hẹn gặp lại mọi người trong những video tiếp theo nhé.